Are you thinking about building a tunnel on sloping land? Wondering if you'll need excavation equipment or if you'll qualify for the NRCS cost share? Do you wonder if the slope you have on your farm is too extreme? This video will show you how I answered those questions for my farmlet. I'm Kat the farmer, and here in the Blue Ridge Mountains, we don't have a lot of level farmland. So I had to work with the land that I had, and over the past 2 years, I put up 3 tunnels, all in different situations of slope and undulating terrain. So I'll show you what I've done and the hurdles I came up across in the building process and how I worked around them. And stick with me to the very end and I'll show you my favorite tip for setting up permanent beds in your high tunnel. So when we're talking about slope, we're usually talking about a percentage. And to figure out what percentage of slope you have on your farm, you're going to measure the rise over a certain amount of feet. So let's say there's a 1 foot elevation change over 30 foot. I'm going to take 1 divided by 30 and multiply that by 100 to get a percentage. That information is going to be useful for sharing with your NRCS agent so that you can tell them, I have a 16% slope. Is that okay? Will I still qualify? And you can also tell your tunnel manufacturer that I have a 5 foot difference between end wall to end wall, or my sidewalls are going to be 2 foot difference from each other, and that way they can advise you on what different assortment of parts you might need to compensate for that. As you're picking out a site for your tunnel, if you can, choose to go parallel to the grade. Like this tunnel is, you can see the slope goes from side to side, not the length of the tunnel. So it's not, the tunnel's not crawling uphill, so to speak, it's going across the hill. And it's also a south-facing slope, so I probably wouldn't want to put a tunnel on a north-facing slope because the whole point of having a tunnel is for season extension and growing in the winter, and that winter sun just isn't going to hit and thaw the plants on a north-facing slope. So luckily, although I didn't have level land, I had sloping land, it's south-facing sloping land, so that's a little bit of a benefit or a silver lining here. So one of the first considerations in building your tunnel is how you want your peak of your tunnel to look. Is it going to be perfectly level? Is it going to follow the slope of the land? Or is it going to caterpillar over it? Now, following the slope of the land and caterpillaring over it were not an option for me and my personality. I wanted it to be perfectly level because I wanted each of the tunnels to just sort of look like they matched as much as possible instead of the varying heights and angles in the landscape. So the benefits of that are that the metal purlins are all really easy to install because the whole structure is straight and the land underneath is undulating and sloping and doing what it will, but the peak of the tunnel and everything associated with it is square and straight and level. If you do decide to put a little slope in your tunnel, if it's straight and it's only about 1 foot over 50 foot of length, I think that will work. I've actually heard that it'll create a convection current in your tunnel that's equivalent to a 16-inch exhaust fan. So that could be beneficial. I chose to go with straight and make the construction process and the strength of the tunnel a lot better. So if you're building a tunnel on sloped land, the most important thing is getting a good foundation. So the foundation of a tunnel is the ground posts. That's each of these posts that are hammered into the ground or driven into the ground, and that's what the bows lock into. So you'll want your ground posts. If you want your peak to be level, you want the ground posts to be level too. So you'll drive them in so that the very top of them is string line level. But if your land's sloping too much, you might need longer ground posts on one side and maybe even shorter ground posts on the other side. So the Byler's greenhouse kit I think comes with 5 foot ground posts, but instead I ordered 4 foot and 9 foot for this side because of the 5 foot elevation change, which is a 16% slope for this tunnel in order to make it level. And that was important for structural support, bearing that snow load, and making everything work out. Another unique situation in a tunnel on sloping land is that your sidewall curtains won't be able to open the same amount. Just make sure you make them as large as possible, but understand that one side's going to open shorter than the other side, which can open taller because of the slope. Just make sure that your hip board at the top isn't too far over, because it tends to drip a line of condensation onto your bed, so you want to make sure that's on the outside of where your bed's going to be placed. So while we're on the subject of the sidewall curtains, in order for roll down or roll up curtains to function, the hip board and the baseboard need to be parallel. So in this house, the slope was such that the baseboard is hitting the ground over there and hovering over the ground here, about 2 feet. So I needed something to fill in below the baseboard to keep the air from coming in. And I chose this corrugated metal, riveted together and buried 6 inches in the ground to stop the creeping weeds, stop that air. And I like it because I can cultivate right up against it and it doesn't rip. Although if you're feeling cheap, you could use leftover greenhouse plastic or polycarbonate or something that's, going to handle all the sun and moisture, and solve that problem of having a space under this hovering baseboard. It's not the worst thing in the world to have a hovering baseboard. It's kind of nice to keep that direct wind off your plants. A lot of folks will design in a knee wall like this into their tunnel. Some folks like to insulate it too, so just think about things creatively, and maybe what seems like a problem is actually a benefit, and just make sure your hip board and your baseboard are darn near parallel and darn near level. So in your cropping system, if you're going to be trellising and you're hoping to trellis by attaching things to the structure of the tunnel itself, that's not going to be so easy in a situation where the earth is much farther from the tunnel on one side than it is on the uphill bed. So you may have to amend your trellising plan to include something like T-posts on one side and caliper clips on the other side. Not everything is going to work universally throughout the tunnel. Maybe you need a ladder on one side, but you can't even fit a ladder on the other side. Things like that you might want to think about. Another issue about putting a tunnel on a grade is that water is going to flow down and seep into your tunnel, or maybe flow right through it. Depending on how steep of a grade you're dealing with, you're going to want to escort that water to another location. So I'm going to have this plastic sheeting down, some rocks, some drain tile, perforated drain tile to escort my water out into the side, and that'll keep the water from seeping into those top beds. After all, controlling the moisture in a tunnel is part of what makes them so great at growing crops. So as you're putting together your order with the tunnel manufacturer, not only are you going to ask them if you need longer or shorter ground posts, but you may also need different parts for your end walls, either longer or more end wall framing materials because you have more of an unusual shape to work with. And the downhill side for my tunnel needed really long polycarbonate panels. Actually, they didn't make them that long, so I had to fill in below with some of the scraps. That's another thing to think about as you're talking with your tunnel manufacturer. Another consideration is going to be doors. So there's only certain types of doors that will work on a hillside. You can use a swing door or a sliding door or a roll-up door, but swing doors, sliding doors, and roll-up doors have square bottoms, and your earth is slanty. So there's going to be a triangle that you need to fill in, or maybe you need to manufacture a door that matches the slope of your land to compensate for that. And sliders like this one can only slide one direction, and that's the downhill direction. And same with swing doors. They can only swing open one direction so that you don't have to excavate your land on the uphill side to make space for the arc of that door or the sliding path of that door. But I really like these wide, 8-foot wide doors. It's a big barn door. It just goes to one direction, and it works great. I hope this video has been helpful to help you think about all those little details that go into building on a less than ideal site. You can probably do it if you're willing to work with these constraints. I know I'm really happy to have 3 tunnels on my farm because it allows me to grow further into the winter and earlier into the spring. It's a great thing. Now, if you stick with me for just a few more seconds, I'll show you a little trick for setting up your beds in your tunnel so that they're always in the same spot. So once you go about building your tunnel, you'll want to set up your beds and make them all evenly measured out. And if you're doing no-till, it may be important to you to set up your beds in the same place every time you do a bed flip. So the aisle's always in the same place. So how do you do that? Well, you use a string line, but you don't want your string line up all the time because you'll trip on it. And it's kind of annoying to have to stake the corners of each bed because you trip on your stakes or the stakes move and then your beds move. So instead of doing that, I have a string line that I can deploy. I just have 1 or 2. And every time I do a bed flip, I attach it back here to a little screw on the end wall. So there's screws all along both the end walls, equidistant, and this is what my string line attaches to. That's my trick. Thanks for watching.